The sun rose over Brookhaven Park, casting golden light through the trees and onto the winding jogging paths that snaked through the upscale neighborhood. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of dew, and birds filled the morning silence with their cheerful songs. For Alina Carter, this was the best part of her day. A moment to breathe, reflect, and prepare for the battles ahead. Dressed in sleek athletic wear, her wireless earbuds nestled securely in place, Alina jogged at a steady pace. At 38, she had risen to become the Director of Internal Affairs for the state police, a position that was as demanding as it was isolating. Her days were spent rooting out corruption and enforcing accountability in a system that often resisted change. The challenges were relentless, but Alina's resolve was unwavering. This morning run was her sanctuary, a space where she could momentarily set aside the weight of her responsibilities. Brookhaven, with its pristine streets and picturesque parks, had become her new refuge. She had moved here not for its luxury, but for the peace it promised. A peace that was abruptly shattered when the sound of a slow-moving car interrupted her rhythm. A police cruiser crawled along the path's edge, its engine a low growl. Behind the wheel sat Officer Daniel Hunt, his gaze fixed on Alina. To him, the sight of a black woman jogging through this predominantly white neighborhood was reason enough for suspicion. Raised by a father who had instilled in him a warped sense of authority, Daniel saw himself as the community's gatekeeper. As Alina jogged past, Daniel's prejudice filled the blanks. He flipped on his lights and pulled his car to a stop ahead of her. Alina slowed, removing one earbud, a frown creasing her brow. She had encountered this before, the quiet sting of being out of place in someone else's eyes, but familiarity didn't lessen the insult. Daniel stepped out, his posture rigid, his tone sharp. "Hey you! What are you doing here?" Alina gestured to her running gear, her voice steady. "Jogging. I live nearby." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "We got a report of someone suspicious matching your description. Trespassing, maybe theft. Care to explain?" Alina's calm cracked for just a moment. "Excuse me. I live 2 blocks from here. I jog this path every day." But Daniel wasn't interested in explanations. He folded his arms. "Got any ID on you?" When she told him she didn't, his smirk was triumphant. "Convenient. No proof you belong here. You know how that looks, right?" Nearby onlookers began filming the encounter, their murmurs growing louder. Alina's jaw tightened, but her voice remained calm. "Officer, I suggest you think carefully about your next move. You're making a mistake." But Daniel only saw defiance. His hand moved to his cuffs. "Turn around, hands behind your back." Little did he know, the woman he was about to arrest wasn't just another jogger. Alina's heartbeat quickened, but she maintained her composure as Daniel approached, cuffs in hand. Around them, the murmurs of onlookers grew louder, some emboldened enough to call out. "She hasn't done anything," a young man shouted, phone raised to capture every second. "This is ridiculous," an older woman exclaimed, clutching her dog's leash tightly. Daniel ignored them all, his focus on Alina as he grabbed her arm. "You've resisted long enough," he growled, snapping the cuffs onto her wrists with unnecessary force. Alina winced but didn't resist. Her calm, authoritative voice cut through the tense air. "You've crossed a line you can't uncross, officer." Daniel's face twisted with frustration. To him, her calmness wasn't strength, it was defiance. He radioed for backup, exaggerating his report. "This is Officer Hunt. Suspect apprehended. Violent resistance. Need assistance immediately." The crowd gasped in unison. "Violent? Are you kidding me?" A woman cried out. "We've got it all on video." Daniel waved them off. "Step back. This is a police matter." But the onlookers didn't budge. Phones remained trained on him, documenting every word, every movement. Alina allowed herself a small, knowing smile as Daniel shoved her into the back of his cruiser. He slammed the door shut, his hand shaking slightly as he felt the weight of the crowd's silent judgment. As the patrol car pulled away, Daniel glanced at Alina in the rearview mirror. Her expression was unreadable, calm and unshaken. "You don't seem too worried," he muttered, trying to regain control of the situation. Alina tilted her head slightly, meeting his gaze through the mirror. "That's because I'm not." The car ride was silent, except for the distant crackle of Daniel's radio. Alina leaned back, her wrists sore, but her resolve stronger than ever. Every bump in the road brought her closer to a confrontation Daniel was woefully unprepared for. When they arrived at the station, Daniel yanked open the door and pulled Alina out roughly. "One for trespassing and resisting arrest," he barked to the desk officer, slapping down the paperwork. She got feisty. Alina raised an eyebrow, amused despite the situation. "Feisty," she repeated under her breath, her tone almost mocking. She stood tall, her calm demeanor unshaken, as officers nearby exchanged curious glances. Daniel felt a flicker of unease as he fumbled through the booking process. Something about her confidence unnerved him. He brushed it off, telling himself he'd done the right thing. But the station doors burst open, and a commanding voice sliced through the tension. "Hunt, what the hell have you done?" Captain Evelyn Monroe stormed in, her sharp features and fiery eyes immediately commanding the room. She held a tablet in one hand, her grip so tight her knuckles were white. Daniel froze, turning toward her, the smirk fading from his face. "Captain Monroe," he stammered, "I was just—" "Save it." Evelyn slammed the tablet onto the counter, its screen lit with a live-streamed video of Daniel's encounter with Alina. The footage had already gone viral, with thousands of comments pouring in. Evelyn's voice dropped to a dangerous level. "Do you even know who this is?" Daniel blinked, glancing nervously at Alina, who now wore the faintest smile. "She said she lives in the area, but—" "This," Evelyn interrupted, her tone sharp as a blade, "is Alina Carter, Director of Internal Affairs for the State Police. Your boss's boss." Daniel's face drained of color as the weight of his mistake hit him like a freight train. He turned to Alina, his mouth opening and closing, searching for words. "I didn't know," he whispered. Alina stepped forward, her voice calm but cutting. "You didn't have to know who I was. You only needed to treat me with the respect every citizen deserves. And you failed." The silence in the room was deafening, every officer watching as Daniel's world began to crumble. The tension in the room was palpable. Daniel Hunt stood frozen, the weight of Captain Evelyn Monroe's words pressing down on him. The officers nearby exchanged uneasy glances, their collective silence amplifying the severity of the situation. Alina Carter stepped forward, her calm and composed demeanor unshaken, though the marks on her wrists from the handcuffs were a sharp reminder of the humiliation she'd endured. "Captain Monroe," she began, her voice measured but firm. "Before we proceed, I'd like to see Officer Hunt's personnel file. Immediately." Evelyn nodded, her sharp eyes narrowing at Hunt. "You heard her. Pull his file." An officer scurried to a nearby computer, the keyboard clattering as he searched for the record. Within moments, the screen displayed a damning list of reports. Evelyn leaned over the desk, scrolling through the entries. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she read. Multiple complaints of excessive force, an alarming pattern of targeting minority individuals, and several internal warnings that had been brushed aside. Evelyn's gaze snapped back to Daniel, her tone icy. "How did you think this wouldn't catch up to you?" Daniel's face reddened, his mouth opening as if to defend himself, but no words came out. He stood there, exposed and vulnerable, the arrogance that had defined him now completely stripped away. Alina didn't flinch. Her voice carried the weight of authority and unyielding resolve. "Officer Hunt, your behavior today is not an isolated incident. It's the symptom of a deeper issue. A culture within this department that has allowed misconduct like yours to go unchecked." She turned to Evelyn. "I want a full review of every stop, every complaint, and every incident this officer has been involved in. Effective immediately." Evelyn nodded. "Consider it done." Without hesitation, she reached forward and ripped the badge from Hunt's chest. As of this moment, you're suspended without pay. Pending further investigation, your badge and gun are forfeited. And let me make one thing clear. If the evidence supports what I've seen so far, you won't just lose your job. You'll face criminal charges. The room erupted in whispers. Officers who had once admired Daniel's confidence now looked away, unwilling to meet his eyes. Alina stepped closer to him, her voice low but cutting. This isn't about me being the director of internal affairs. If I were anyone else, just another jogger, you would have done the same thing. That's the problem. Daniel's face burned with humiliation, his voice cracking as he finally spoke. I didn't know. You didn't care, Alina interrupted sharply. You judged me before I even said a word. You saw my skin, not my humanity. The silence that followed was deafening. Evelyn gestured toward the door. Escort him out. 2 officers stepped forward, gently but firmly guiding Daniel out of the station. His shoulders slumped, his confidence shattered. The man who had strutted into the station just hours earlier now looked small, broken, and utterly defeated. As the door closed behind him, Evelyn turned to Alina. I can't apologize enough for what happened. It shouldn't have come to this. Alina's gaze softened, but her resolve remained. It's not your apology I'm looking for, Captain. It's action. This department needs reform. Systemic change doesn't happen by accident. It happens by choice. Evelyn nodded. You'll have my full cooperation. This is just the beginning. Outside, the video of Daniel's arrest of Alina had already gone viral, sparking national outrage. By the time Alina left the station, a crowd had gathered, reporters and community members demanding answers. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust toward her, but Alina stood tall, her voice clear. This isn't just about one officer, she said, addressing the crowd. It's about a system that has allowed prejudice and abuse to thrive. That stops now. Change begins today. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the streets. Alina turned, her steps confident, knowing the fight ahead would be long and arduous. But she also knew this was her purpose, a battle worth fighting. Justice was just beginning. The morning sun illuminated the steps of Brookhaven Police Headquarters as Alina Carter faced a growing crowd of reporters, activists, and community members. News of her wrongful arrest had spread like wildfire, turning her into an unexpected symbol of justice and accountability. Cameras clicked and microphones hovered close as she prepared to address the nation. Captain Evelyn Monroe stood beside her, her expression stoic but supportive. Behind them, a banner reading "Justice and Accountability for All" fluttered in the breeze. The crowd hushed as Alina stepped forward, her posture commanding and her voice steady. What happened to me yesterday, Alina began, her tone even but resolute, was not an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a system that too often allows bias to dictate actions and ignores the humanity of the people it serves. The crowd murmured in agreement, their faces a mix of anger and hope. Alina's arrest video had sparked outrage, but it had also brought long-buried grievances to the surface. For many, her story was their story, a moment that finally captured the injustice they'd endured for years. I am here today, Alina continued, not just as a victim of misconduct, but as someone who believes in the possibility of change. We cannot allow incidents like this to go unchallenged. We must hold ourselves and our institutions accountable. Applause erupted, but Alina raised her hand to quiet the crowd. This is not just about Officer Hunt. It's about a culture that allows prejudice and abuse to fester unchecked. That ends now. Alina turned to Evelyn, who stepped forward to speak. As captain of this department, Evelyn said, her voice firm, I take full responsibility for addressing the failures within our ranks. We are launching an independent review of every officer's conduct, past and present. We will not tolerate discrimination, misconduct, or abuse of power. Reporters shouted questions, but Alina and Evelyn remained poised. After a moment, Alina took the microphone again. Real change requires more than apologies or reviews. It demands action. I'm calling for immediate reforms, including mandatory bias training, stricter oversight, and a transparent complaint review process. The crowd roared in approval, their voices blending into a chant, "Justice now! Justice now!" Alina stepped back, her heart pounding but her resolve firm. This was more than a personal victory. It was the beginning of a movement. Meanwhile, across town, Daniel Hunt sat alone in his dimly lit apartment. His badge and gun had been confiscated, and the weight of his suspension pressed heavily on him. He stared at the viral video of his arrest on his phone, the comments scrolling past like an unrelenting tide of judgment. Disgusting abuse of power. Shameful. This is why we need reform. Each word cut deeper than the last. Daniel had once believed himself untouchable, but now his name was synonymous with everything wrong in law enforcement. His phone buzzed with a call from his father, a retired officer who had once shaped Daniel's misguided view of authority. He hesitated before "Airs the family," his father growled. "Do you know what you've done?" Daniel clenched his jaw. "I didn't know who she was." "It doesn't matter who she was," his father snapped. "You've ruined your career and ours." As the call ended, Daniel slumped into his chair, the gravity of his actions finally sinking in. For the first time, he felt not just anger, but shame. Deep down, he knew Alina Carter wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting against people like him. And she was winning. A new beginning. Back at headquarters, Alina returned to her office, her inbox flooded with messages of support from across the nation. She took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the screen. Every email, every message was a reminder of how far-reaching this moment had become. A knock at the door pulled her attention. Evelyn stepped in, her expression softer than before. "You've lit a fire," she said, a faint smile on her lips. "People are listening." Alina nodded, her determination unwavering. "Now we make sure it doesn't burn out." This was more than a single act of justice. It was the beginning of something far greater. And Alina Carter was ready to lead the charge. Alina sat in her office, a cup of tea cooling on the desk beside her. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of her computer as she scrolled through an overwhelming flood of emails and messages. Voices of support poured in from all corners of the country. Community leaders, activists, and even a few officers from other precincts who thanked her for her courage. But the messages also carried the weight of responsibility. Change wasn't just a hope anymore, it was a demand. Her phone buzzed. It was Evelyn Monroe. "They've completed the preliminary review of Hunt's file," Evelyn said. Her voice was steady, but Alina caught an undercurrent of tension. "It's worse than we thought." Alina's fingers tightened around the phone. "How bad?" 18 complaints filed against him over the past 5 years. Excessive force, racial profiling, harassment, not one of them escalated beyond a warning. Alina closed her eyes, anger simmering beneath her calm exterior. "And the supervisors who ignored this? They'll be reviewed as well," Evelyn replied. "But Hunt isn't the only one. We're finding patterns across the board. This department needs more than reform. It needs rebuilding." Alina leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. "Then let's rebuild it." Across town, Daniel Hunt sat slumped at a bar, nursing a glass of whiskey as the television above the counter blared the evening news. Alina's face filled the screen as the anchor recapped the unfolding story. Director Alina Carter has become a national figure in the fight for police accountability. Her call for reform has sparked widespread debate, with law enforcement agencies across the country facing pressure to reevaluate their practices. Daniel scowled, downing the last of his drink. The bartender glanced at him, hesitant to engage, but Daniel's bitterness spilled out anyway. "She's making me out to be a monster," he muttered. "I was just doing my job." The bartender shrugged, wiping down the counter. "Doesn't sound like it, man. You messed with the wrong person. Daniel slammed the glass down, his frustration bubbling over. But deep down, he couldn't shake the gnawing guilt. He'd spent his entire career believing he was protecting his community. Now he saw the truth. He'd been protecting himself. The community gathers that evening. Alina attended a community meeting in Brookhaven. The small auditorium was packed, people spilling into the aisles. Residents, activists, and even a few local officers sat shoulder to shoulder, united by a shared desire for change. Alina stepped up to the podium, scanning the room. She saw the pain and frustration etched on many faces, but she also saw hope. "Thank you for coming," she began, her voice steady but full of emotion. "This is not just about my experience, it's about all of us. About every time someone has been judged unfairly, treated unjustly, or silenced. This is our chance to change that." A man in the audience raised his hand. "How do we know this won't just be another moment that fades away?" Alina met his gaze, her voice firm. "Because we won't let it. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen because of one person. It happens when we all demand it, and when we hold each other accountable." The room erupted in applause. As the meeting continued, residents shared their own stories of discrimination, and Alina listened, taking notes and promising action. By the end of the night, the energy in the room was electric. For the first time, the people of Brookhaven felt like they had a voice, and a leader who would fight for them. A reckoning approaches. Back at the station, Evelyn and Alina worked late into the night, combing through files and planning the next steps. Alina's fight wasn't just against individual officers like Hunt. It was against the system that had protected them for so long. "Tomorrow, we release the findings of Hunt's review," Evelyn said, closing a thick folder with a sigh. "It's going to be ugly." "Good," Alina replied without hesitation. "People need to see the truth." As the clock struck midnight, Alina stood and stretched, her body tired but her mind sharp. "This is just the beginning." Evelyn nodded. "And you're the right person to see it through." Alina smiled faintly, her determination unwavering. The cracks in the system were beginning to show, and she was ready to break it wide open. The following morning, the press conference room at the Brookhaven Police Headquarters was packed. Journalists jostled for position, microphones were adjusted, and cameras rolled as the department prepared to reveal the findings of Officer Daniel Hunt's internal review. The air was charged with anticipation and unease. At the center of it all stood Alina Carter, flanked by Captain Evelyn Monroe and a small team of independent investigators who had been brought in to ensure transparency. Alina's expression was calm, her shoulders squared, but the weight of the moment was evident in her steady breathing. She stepped forward to the podium, her eyes scanning the sea of faces. "This investigation," Alina began, her voice firm, "was not about one bad officer. It was about uncovering systemic failures that have allowed misconduct and abuse of power to go unchecked." Behind her, a large screen displayed the findings in bold letters. 18 complaints ignored. 7 alleged use of force incidents. No accountability. The room fell silent as Alina continued. Officer Hunt's record reveals a disturbing pattern of behavior, enabled by a culture that prioritizes protection of its own over accountability. Complaints were filed by citizens, men and women of this community, but were dismissed or buried. Those responsible for oversight failed in their duties. Gasps rippled through the audience, and a few journalists whispered to one another as Alina detailed specific incidents. Each case painted a damning picture. Excessive stops of minority residents, unprovoked use of force, and blatant racial profiling. "Let me be clear," Alina said, her voice rising slightly. "This is not just about Officer Hunt. He is a symptom of a deeper issue. The review we've conducted has identified systemic problems that extend far beyond one officer. Today marks the beginning of a comprehensive overhaul of this department." Evelyn Monroe stepped forward, her tone grave. "As of today, Multiple officers, including supervisors who ignored warning signs, have been placed under investigation. Reforms are being implemented immediately, including mandatory bias training, independent oversight, and a public complaints process to ensure transparency. The crowd erupted in questions, hands shooting up. A reporter called out, "Director Carter, what's the long-term plan to rebuild trust in this community?" Alina met the reporter's gaze. Trust is not rebuilt with words, but with actions. This department will earn the trust of this community by proving it values integrity and justice above all else. That starts now. The fallout. The announcement sent shockwaves through Brookhaven and beyond. On social media, videos of the press conference were shared millions of times, alongside hashtags like Justice in Brookhaven and Accountability Now. Calls for reform spread to neighboring cities, where activists demanded similar investigations into their own police departments. Daniel Hunt watched the press conference from the living room of his small apartment. His jaw clenched as he saw Alina standing tall, delivering the damning details of his career for the world to hear. The shame and anger that had simmered within him now boiled over. "This isn't fair," he muttered to himself. But even as he said it, he knew the truth. His actions, his decisions, his biases, they had all led to this moment. And deep down, he knew it was deserved. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was his lawyer, a weary-looking man carrying a briefcase. "You're going to need to cooperate fully," the lawyer said without preamble. "The evidence against you is overwhelming." Daniel sank into the couch, the reality of his situation hitting him like a tidal wave. His badge was gone, his career over, and now he faced the possibility of criminal charges. He had been the one to wield power so carelessly, and now he was at the mercy of the very system he had abused. Building the future. Later that evening, Alina returned to the community center, where another meeting was underway. The room was filled with people from all walks of life, students, elders, activists, and even a few officers who wanted to be part of the solution. The young woman stood to speak, her voice trembling. "How do we know this won't just be another promise that fades away? We've heard this before." Alina stepped forward, her tone both empathetic and resolute. "Because I won't let it fade. And because you won't either. Change doesn't come from the top down. It comes from all of us. Hold me accountable. Hold this department accountable. And never stop demanding better." The room erupted in applause. For the first time in years, many in the community felt something they had long lost: hope. As Alina looked out at the crowd, she felt a sense of purpose unlike any she'd ever known. The journey ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but she was ready. This was more than a fight for justice. It was a fight for the soul of a community, and she would see it through to the end. The spark she had ignited was now a flame, and it would not be extinguished. The early morning sun bathed Brookhaven in a golden light, a peaceful contrast to the storm of change sweeping through the town. Alina Carter stood on the steps of City Hall, overlooking the largest crowd she'd ever seen. Signs reading "Justice for All" and "Accountability Now" waved in the air, their bright colors punctuating the sea of faces. Today was a historic day, not just for Brookhaven, but for communities across the nation. Alina adjusted the microphone, her fingers brushing against the paper she had prepared. Though she knew she wouldn't need it, her words would come from the heart. "Good morning," she began, her voice carrying over the crowd. "Today, we stand together, not as individuals divided by fear or prejudice, but as a community united by hope and purpose." The crowd erupted into cheers, their energy palpable. Alina paused, letting the moment sink in before continuing. "Months ago, I found myself in a situation that could have broken me," she said, her voice steady but laced with emotion. But instead, it opened the door to something greater. It revealed cracks in the foundation of a system that was supposed to protect us. And together, we've started to rebuild that foundation, stronger, fairer, and more just. Behind her, Captain Evelyn Monroe and several other key leaders stood as a visible show of solidarity. The reforms they had worked tirelessly to implement were already making a difference. Independent oversight committees were active, bias training programs were mandatory, and a new policy of transparency had begun to rebuild trust between the police and the community. The ripple effect. Across the country, Brookhaven's transformation inspired similar movements. Departments and cities, both large and small, were called to account, and more leaders began embracing change. Alina had become a national figure, her calm yet unyielding determination a beacon of hope. For Daniel Hunt, however, life had taken a starkly different path. Stripped of his badge and disgraced, he now worked as a security guard in a rundown parking lot. The once proud officer had been humbled, forced to confront the consequences of his actions. Every headline about Alina, every mention of her name, was a reminder of what he had lost and why. One evening, as Daniel sat in his booth scrolling through his phone, he came across a video of Alina delivering a speech at a police reform summit. Her words struck a chord he hadn't expected. "Justice isn't about vengeance," Alina said in the video. "It's about creating a system where fairness is the default and every person's dignity is honored." Daniel sat back in his chair, her words echoing in his mind. For the first time, he felt something unfamiliar, a flicker of genuine regret. He couldn't change the past, but he wondered if he could find a way to atone. A personal victory. As the crowd outside City Hall cheered, Alina concluded her speech. "This is not the end of our journey," she said. "It's the beginning. Change is a constant effort, a commitment we make to ourselves and each other. Together we've proven that no injustice is too great to overcome, no system too broken to fix. This is our moment, and we will not waste it." The crowd roared, the sound reverberating through the streets of Brookhaven. Alina stepped back from the podium, her heart full as she looked out over the sea of faces. As the crowd began to disperse, a young girl approached Alina with her mother. The girl held out a hand-drawn picture of Alina standing tall, surrounded by words like justice, hope, and change. "This is for you," the girl said shyly. Alina knelt down to meet her eye level, taking the drawing with a warm smile. "Thank you," she said softly. "This means so much to me." The girl beamed, and Alina felt a deep sense of purpose solidify within her. This wasn't just about policies or systems, it was about people. Every voice mattered, and every life deserved dignity, a lasting legacy. Months turned into years, and Alina's work continued to ripple across the nation. Communities transformed, and conversations about justice and accountability became part of the national fabric. Alina's leadership became a model for others, her story a testament to the power of resilience and courage. Brookhaven flourished under the reforms she had championed. The community, once divided, became a symbol of unity and progress. People of all backgrounds found common ground, and trust between residents and law enforcement grew stronger with each passing day. As for Alina, she remained at the forefront of the fight for justice, but every morning she still jogged through Brookhaven Park, her sanctuary. The golden light filtering through the trees reminded her of how far she had come, and how far there was still to go. Justice, she knew, wasn't a destination. It was a journey, and she was ready to keep moving forward. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss any of our latest videos. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. Thank you all for taking the time to watch, and see you in the next video.